So, hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University, where the四海为学Collaborative Learning Project is based. I want to welcome you to our second book discussion of the四海为学Collaborative Learning Project for the 2024-2025 academic year. Today we will be discussing Professor Tristan Brown's book, Laws of the Land, Fengshui, and the State in Qing Dynasty China. Professor Brown works at MIT in the History Department. And our chair, Cuilan Liu, is from University of Pittsburgh. And our three discussants include Professor Robin Wang from Loyola Marymount University, Dr. Wanmeng from the University of Southern California, and Professor Wang from Stanford University. It is becoming a tradition here at 四海为学to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there's any younger scholar in the audience who wishes to be part of future events, please email me. This event will be 2 hours in total, ending promptly at 11 a.m. Beijing time. First, Professor Brown will introduce his book, and then we will have a conversation with each of the discussants before opening to questions from the audience. Before getting things started and handing them over to Professor Cuilan Liu, I want to say a few things about the 四海为学Collaborative Learning Academic Forum. The 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and "look at me, I'm smarter than you," or "don't I know so much," and similar attitudes that we sometimes find in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be somewhat of a counterbalance for the negative attitudes often found in blind reviews. While there is a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity in academia, there should also be just as much time and place for speaking to one another in a more congenial and community-forming setting. The neologism 四海为学 was created by Robin Wang, who's gracing us here today. And it's a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea in the foreground at all of our events. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchanges by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people truly learn from and with one another. So before introducing our chair, I want to once again thank Professors Tristan Brown, Cuilan Liu, Robin Wang, Wanmeng, and Wang for taking time and for sharing with us today. Our chair is Professor Cuilan Liu. She is Assistant Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on the interaction between Buddhism and law, with a geographical focus on China, Tibet, and India. Her first book, Buddhism in Court, Religion, Law, and Jurisdiction in China, was published with Oxford University Press in May 2024. Her peer-reviewed articles have been published in History of Religions, Journal of Law and Religion, Journal of Chinese Religions, Journal of International Association of Buddhist Studies, Journal of the American Oriental Society, Journal of Indian Philosophy, etc. We are very happy to have you here, Cuilan Liu. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor D'Ambrosio, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful event. So we gathered here to celebrate and also talk about Professor Tristan Brown's new book, The Land of Law. And it was so heartwarming to hear you illustrating the vibe and also the goal for this platform. And I'm even happier hearing you saying those words. So without further ado, since Professor Tristan Brown is going to be the central figure for tonight's event. I wanted to save as much time as possible so that we can dedicate our time to talking about his research, his writing, and also, the wonderful work that he has done in this book. So one of my central goal as the chair is to keep us on time while having productive and exciting conversations. So the instruction that I've been given is that we will have I will introduce Professor Brown first, and then he will have about 20 minutes to give us a brief introduction of the book. And after that, I will invite each one of the three commentators to give to give your comments and raise your questions. And in total, and then Professor Brown will respond to those questions. And in total, each round of conversation will be about 15 minutes. So for our commentators, if you can limit your time, your questions and comments to about 5 to 7 minutes, so that Tristan can have enough time to respond, that will be great. And after that, depending on how much time we have, I may, take advantage of my role as chair to raise several questions, because I had such a good time reading this book, and I work on religion and law, and I'm diving into archives, and this is like all the work that Tristan has done in this book. It's so wonderful. I just, I may raise one or two questions, but I want to also to make sure that during the 2 hours that we have, we will definitely save some time for the audiences, for questions and comments that they can ask our authors today. So that's what we're going to do. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce the author of our book to be discussed tonight. Professor Tristan Brown is the SC Fang Chinese Language and Culture Career Development Professor at MIT, where he researches the history of early modern and modern China. His research focuses on the ways in which law, science, environment, and religion interacted in China from the 16th to the 19th centuries. His first book, which I'm holding in my hands, oh my gosh, my background. So Laws of the Land, Fengshui, and the State in Qing Dynasty China came out with Princeton University Press last year in 2023. This book examines the Qing judicial archives to investigate the uses of cosmology in Chinese law during an era of great economic and environmental change. He also followed up on that monograph by editing a special issue of History of Science and Technology dedicated to the history of Chinese astronomy and correlative astrology in the late empire. And he's now preparing a second book that's quite different from the first one. And in this second book, he's going to employ Chinese, Arabic, and Persian sources to examine the history of Islam in Ming Dynasty China, when many Muslim communities integrated into the Chinese society. So without further ado, let's talk about his first book, and then maybe in a couple of years, we can talk about his second book. So Professor Brown, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Cuilan. That's such a generous introduction. I want to thank everybody, all of our discussants, for being here today. And Paul, thank you so much for organizing this. Without further ado, I'll share my PowerPoint. I've cut it down. I've moved some things around. And I'll just say, okay, play from current slide. Okay, you can all see this, right? Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. So just as a warning, I knew we were going to have an audience, some people from mainland China, some people from US or whatever. I have a combination of English, Zhentitzi, and Fantitzi in this whole PowerPoint. So please excuse it's kind of eclecticness. But I hope you find it of interest. So I'm going to talk today very briefly. Here's the game plan for today. So I'm going to start by this question of, how do we investigate feng shui? How do we study this topic, right? When I started out this book project, a lot of people were asking me, how can you write a history book about feng shui? So I'm going to talk about how I did that and how I situate this book in terms of the field. And then I'll talk about sort of the role that what feng shui tells us about Chinese legal history, right, which is the core of the book. I'll talk about feng shui and wealth, success, all the good things that feng shui brought people and still bring people today. And then I'll talk about the book's key conclusions. In the end, I thought I would say something about what feng shui might tell us about the environmental humanities, right? This Huanjing Renwen. kind of as a big think piece that I thought might get some questions going in the audience. Okay, so let's start out with to say, how do we study feng shui? How could we do this, right? Okay, I'm going to give you two ways, which are perfectly fine to do, but I'm going to identify their limitations. So the first thing is we could read classics of feng shui literature. That's a perfectly fine way to do it. And there's a lot to be gained by reading those classics of feng shui literature, the Book of Burial and so forth. The limitation of that approach, however, is that these classics of feng shui literature are very abstract, right? They're very general. They don't tell us how people actually practiced feng shui. They don't tell us how it was actually mobilized in society at the time. What are the real case studies, right? What does it look like on the ground? So that's the limitation with that approach. The second approach is we can go to China. We could go to Taiwan. We could go to Hong Kong and Singapore and all these places, and we could do field work. And plenty of people have done that, and that's a good approach as well. The problem with this approach is that, of course, it focuses on a very changed landscape. It's the late 20th century or the 21st century. So this poses us a question, right? Okay, we have feng shui classics on one hand, rooted in the Tang Dynasty, the Song Dynasty, or whatever. And on the other hand, we have like ethnographic fieldwork, which is also great, but it has this limitation. So what's the answer? What's my approach, right? My approach was I started off in legal history reading legal cases, and I started to read more and more legal cases. I found more and more legal cases that were about feng shui questions. And so then I realized feng shui, these legal cases actually can solve a major historiographical problem, right? Which is, how did people in China actually use feng shui? How did they actually think about feng shui? How did they debate feng shui in real time? And so that's really what I think the sort of the methodological intervention of the book. And I say one way that you could think about it is in trying to show how Chinese law worked, which was my initial intent, I accidentally stumbled upon, I think, how feng shui worked, right? Which was not my original intent, but I ended up writing a book about it. Okay. So just to say something about state of the field, there's a growing number of books in Chinese legal studies that are looking at the intersection of law and something else, law and religion, or the uses of religion in Chinese law, the uses of law in Chinese religion, so on and so forth. So Laws of the Land certainly speaks to that growing body of literature. But I think I wanted to distill what my key insight was in like two major ways: a general observation and a specific observation. The general observation is like this. Legal systems around the world, past and present, have often depended on external forms of knowledge in order to work. The law also influences knowledge systems beyond the law. So, for instance, we all can recognize medical knowledge is used in law in the case of forensics. In the case of American law and many parts of American constitutional history, racial categories have influenced legal practices and informed law. So you can kind of think of those examples, and there are many more examples like that. But the specific claim I bring out in the book is that Chinese law and the Qing depended on feng shui knowledge. And part of the joy that I have to share with all of you today is showing you that that's different than saying Chinese law depended on custom. Okay, I don't think feng shui was just a custom, right? I think there was something more to it than that. So Chinese law and the Qing depended on this body of knowledge, this evolving body of knowledge. Now, the law in its engagement with feng shui also shaped the way people thought about feng shui. Okay, so this was a kind of two-way interaction. All right. Let me say something about the sources that I use in the book, right? So, of course, I mentioned the legal case. So first of all, I give you this quote. I enjoy this quote. There are a lot of legal cases about feng shui from the late imperial period. Officials complained about it all the time. We hear here, the Hunan Anchashi, Zhou Renji, he says every time our office in Hunan opens for accepting legal cases or submissions, half of the cases are about feng shui. Now, that might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but the point is there are a lot of these cases. So I use about 500. I use 500 of them in the book, from Sichuan, from Taiwan, from Beijing, etc. I also use maps drawn out to record or investigate feng shui, and I also use these feng shui manuals, right? How to practice feng shui. So the book tries to bring these three bodies of sources together and tell a story about what's going on in Chinese society during the Qing. Okay, now this question of how do you disturb feng shui? Okay, through the analysis of those 500 cases, I have distilled about 4 major ways in which feng shui could be disturbed. One is you cut down a tree deemed to be connected to feng shui. There are a ton of tree-related cases. So trees are big deals. And there are a lot of these cases across Sichuan, Ba County, Nambu County, you name it, even some in Zhejiang. Taiwan also has these. You'll see it. Trees, of course, are very connected from very early on in China with the resting places of the dead. So there's that connection. There's also, of course, the connection between feng shui and mining. So in places where you mine for coal, especially, or other kinds of mining activities, that can be deemed as injuring the feng shui of the area. You can also have cases that are about water and water sources, water flows, direction of water, basically water rights. And of course, the last but not least example is one that still is very much most associated with feng shui today, is building something that people just don't like or they don't want to exist. And they'll say, feng shui is disturbed, you got to do something about it. All of these can constitute legal cases in Imperial China. And most of the cases about feng shui that I investigated were about one of these 4 categories. Okay, so you can kind of see, for those of you who have read the book or are going to read the book, there are 5 chapters. I talk about, maps in one chapter. I talk about the examination system in another chapter. I talk about mining. And then I talk about, at the very end of the book, the sort of nascent industrialization efforts in China and the mobilization of feng shui in law and politics at that time to kind of stymie some of those efforts. Just to kind of show you really up close, and I know I've already gone over this a little bit, but I just thought I'd bring it in a little bit. These are what these plaints, these lawsuits look like. You can see that they flag often feng shui terminology. You can see here, this is a case about somebody cut down trees and hurt or injured the demai of this family, the veins of this family. Bad stuff is going to happen. That's in the very opening lines of the lawsuit. What's so cool about these archival cases from the Qing is we also have trial transcripts. And these are question and answer that would be held at the county yamen, the county courts, between the magistrate and local people, including the official ruling, typically at the end of the case. So those are kind of like what the sources actually look like. So I thought I'd give you one really quick example. There are many, many examples that I could give. My favorite is oil presses. Oil presses are essential. Oil is essential for cooking all different types of delicious Chinese food. Oil also needs to be created, right? You don't buy it at a grocery store. People actually made it. So they took large amounts of seeds or large amounts of peanuts or you name it, and they would go through a very laborious and loud process of producing the oil. Oil, of course, by nature is flammable. So it also has that sort of danger element to it. So one of the things that we see from feng shui texts, like this one, late 18th century text from Hangzhou, is when you situate a house, you got to be careful to not get a house close to an oil press because it's bad feng shui, bad stuff can happen. So if you look here, you'll find a pitzi, a legal comment written on a lawsuit from Ba County in which the sort of local Qing official says, I think your oil press actually hurt the feng shui of the town. Please find a different place to establish your shop. So in other words, what is happening in this case is that this official is drawing on his knowledge of feng shui. He's not drawing on the local customs of Ba County. This is, again, you could find this principle in books published 2,000 miles away. He's drawing on feng shui knowledge, recognized feng shui knowledge, in either accepting the claim or rejecting the claim. In this case, he accepts it. In many other cases, they reject it. It just depends. And I'll just say that if you look at Chinese towns that are preserved in local gazetteers, you will often find that the oil presses or oil press streets are outside the city walls because exactly they were pretty sensitive sites for the reasons that I mentioned. So down here, you can see in this town, the walled town, it's always Chengwai. It's always outside the town. This is actually true in Imperial Beijing. oil presses, alcohol distilleries, those kind of things that had to be sort of zoned away for feng shui considerations. Okay, so I wanted to give you this kind of question, moving into this notion of feng shui as a knowledge, right? Feng shui as a powerful form of knowledge. Feng shui was always a contested form of knowledge. But to be honest with you, any knowledge worth talking about is always contested, right? There are two quotes that I wanted to just draw from the book that I thought are fun. One is from Zhuge Liang, a fictional quote from Sanguo Yanyi. And Zhuge Liang tells us that, if you want, to be a general, right? If you don't know astrology, if you don't know Dili, if you don't know yin yang, if you don't know, various forms of divination and troop formation and all of this, you're a mediocre talent, right? If you don't know these things, right? Now, that's, very interesting. Zhuge Liang seems to say divination and these forms of knowledge are very important to being such a success. Now, Zhong Guofan tells us that his grandfather never believed in doctors, never believed in monks and shamans, and never believed in feng shui masters. Okay, how do we square these two quotations? And I think this is the essence of really wrapping one's head around what's feng shui doing in late imperial China. This is not a contradiction. Okay, belief in feng shui was everywhere across Chinese society. In doubt about feng shui was everywhere. This is why it's interesting, right? The elites thought real feng shui existed. I'm pretty sure all the way the emperor, the key officials, out there in the universe somewhere, there were places on Earth with good feng shui. The issue was that most people could not understand feng shui. They got it wrong, especially the commoners. They got it wrong all the time. Now, because feng shui was constantly contested, the government got involved in adjudicating it. So it's precisely because of the arguments, of the tensions, that the government gets so involved with feng shui, I surmise, over the last 1,000 years of Chinese history. So one ways that the state deals with this issue is that they hire and employ specialists, right? Literally, they even hire local officials who can help them out. Yin Yang Shui Guan, right? Yin Yang officers, as I term them in the book, and they can help the process of mapping, local adjudication, interpreting the calendar, and all of that, right? All of that stuff. That's one way in which the state sort of dealt with this. But in fact, one thing that we notice in cases is that the officials often think these local feng shui 先生 or 阴阳家他们也不懂feng shui, right? They don't really understand it either. They have some skepticism, the officials, towards them. Now, who really understands feng shui in Qing society? And this is what I think the kind of interesting twist of the book really is. It's Qing officials. Okay, why? They're from wealthy families. They have passed the exams. If anybody has the claim to good feng shui, it has to be them. Okay, even when they tell you, I don't believe in feng shui, they still often seem to know a lot about it. And that comes up again and again in the book. So this is the reason, I surmise, in which local people sought out their opinions so often. They wanted to know because they knew these guys knew it. And it was also a reason why the government could adjudicate these cases with confidence, because of course, we know where the real feng shui is. We understand feng shui. The commoners, the plebs, of course, they want to understand it. This is, I think, a really key insight into what feng shui is actually doing in Qing society. Feng shui is allowing people at the lower end of the power structure to appeal to the authorities in a protest. They're all about protest. They're all saying, we don't want this development to happen. We don't want this to happen. And the authorities do not have their power and authority questioned by this form of protest. It's an appeal to their knowledge. It's an appeal to their authority. So it can work. This is why feng shui can work in law as law. Now, I'll say, I know I have about maybe 4 minutes left or so I won't take that much more time. But I thought I'd say something kind of interesting about this is a potential for future research, I think, for graduate students. How does the government know where good feng shui is? How does the government, get confident about their feng shui knowledge? And what I actually discovered is that the government pays a lot of attention to the Zhuangyuan #1 degree holders. In fact, sometimes even collecting information about their ancestral graves. So this is not simply a knowledge that it's not top down of like the emperor knows everything, does good feng shui, gets good feng shui, and then tells the secrets to some officials. No, it's also the government is on the lookout for new information and cases and all of this stuff, right? You can see this in the Qing Feng Shui Zhonglong, this whole list of great officials and what their feng shui, what their ancestral graves were like. I sort of have created this kind of schema is feng shui as neither local nor imperial. This is not exactly in the book, but I think it's something that I hope future grad students and scholars could really play with and think about from regional, local and regional knowledge, including property values, agricultural treatises and religious texts, the imperial calendar and almanacs, canonical feng shui ideals and printed classical texts, information produced through the examination system. All of these forces interacted with each other to produce an evolving body of knowledge that was neither purely local nor purely national. It can look one or the other at some times, but that's kind of what I think is going on. Okay, so just to say, kind of in the moving towards the sort of environmental or historiographical dimensions of the book, I talk about how I suspect, I argue that feng shui becomes more salient in Qing law due to the variety of environmental, demographic, and social pressures that the Qing is facing in the second half of the dynasty. This is the reason I surmise that feng shui became so contentious during the Yangwu Yundong, the self-strengthening movement, with many, many officials, including the great Li Hongzhang, the great supporter of railway construction, even at one point, even in the early stages, opposing railways in part due to the fact that they would harm feng shui. Of course, he will change his opinion on that. Many Qing officials do not change their opinion on that. And you can see how feng shui kind of became one of the great culture wars that Americans know a lot about of late 19th century China. Okay, so let's just get to the conclusions of the book. One is that I argue that the Qing government gave feng shui a space in legal practice, and I argue that that space needed to be there for the legal system to work. And I say that during the 19th century, population, environmental, and political pressures work together to elevate the salience of feng shui in Qing law. I think those are the two main takeaways of the book. Now, just to kind of finally wrap up and conclude here, I wanted to maybe say something about the environmental humanities, which is something that people often ask me about in regards to feng shui. So I want to say, can feng shui tell us something about the environment today, right? Is there any like big takeaways we can get from this? I'm going to start with the kind of like realistic, pessimistic answer, and then I'll get optimistic. So the first is that feng shui is not a knowledge of environmental protection. And it doesn't have the answer to climate change. And it's not going to save us in the 21st century. So all of that being said, the thing we also have to recognize is that feng shui evolved in China in a rural context. Today, the world, including China, is predominantly urban. So feng shui is, as a knowledge system, is still there. It's not going to go away, but it's going to take time to evolve to this very, very different type of landscape than it had evolved over thousands of years in China. I do think that feng shui's applications in law were primarily about blocking development. That is something, as I'll discuss in just a second, is still very relevant here today. But I think the key here to understanding the 20th century story of feng shui in China is that during the 20th century, the developmental Chinese state didn't want to give its citizens the power to block all that development. So feng shui got stuck with the superstition label. It's actually very understandable why it did, right? We got to build all these railways, including the wonderful high-speed rail we have in China right now. All of that stuff, right? So that's in a way what kind of intellectually happens to it in feng shui. But this reality may change in the future, right? This is always an evolving situation. But I just want to say there is something that I think is really relevant to our current moment that we see in the cases from the Qing Dynasty in the Chinese experience with feng shui. We see that basically, the question of climate change today is a question of belief. right? We have this thing of Americans believe in climate change, or many of them don't believe in climate change. What's going on? And I think we could say climatologists today are tasked with analyzing the environment and making predictions about what may happen in the future. Should their claims hold weight in law, right? Should we consider them? If we do, how much weight should they have? I would just phrase to you, whether we look at the Keystone Pipeline or other major development projects, that's the feng shui question in late imperial China. That's exactly what it is. So in that regard, I think there's a kind of great relevance potentially for us to think about some of, exactly those environmental humanities questions about how do we regulate development and what should legal systems, how do they answer those difficult questions? So thank you so much. I really look forward to the conversation.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm recovering from a cold. Excuse me. Give me 1 minute.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for your short but also very sweet summary of your book. Excuse me. I think in particular, many of us would have appreciated your unveiling of the secret about what's happening behind the scene when you produce such a great book. Sorry. Great. So just moving along our schedule, and we're going to next we're going to introduce Dr. Li Wanmeng as our first commentator, and so sorry. I'm going to very briefly introduce Dr. Li, and after that, you and Tristan will have about 15 minutes.
Thanks so much.
Sorry.
Take your time, please.
Yeah.
This crazy flu season. All right. So Dr. Li's research explores the intricate relationship between literature, religion, and the natural environment during the Middle Period China from 1800 to 1300. Her doctoral work at UCLA studies how literary and Taoist practitioners created a new understanding of the sacred and political landscape of China. And at the moment, Dr. Li works as a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Southern California, and she continues investigating the literary and religious co-construction of natural and cultural geography. Her first book project, entitled Seeking Utopia, Literary Writing on Taoist Sacred Geography in Qing Dynasty China, examines the evolution of literary cultures through the literary representations of grotto heavens, the Dongtian, which are the sacred caves that played a pivotal role in shaping the literary and religious imagination of the time. So without further ado, Dr. Li, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Cuilan, for your introduction, and thank you, Tristan and Paul, for this wonderful opportunity to include me in this event. And let me share some thoughts about Tristan's new, really fascinating, exciting book. So just to save time, I'll get started. Tristan's Law of Land offers a groundbreaking exploration of the intersection between Feng Shui and the Qing Dynasty legal system. This meticulously researched work challenges the traditional Western understandings of Chinese culture and history, demonstrating a profound influence of Feng Shui on the daily lives of ordinary people and the governance of the empire. One of the most impressive aspects of Dr. Brown's work is his ability to challenge the stigmatized concept of feng shui. Unlike many previous studies that have dismissed feng shui as mere superstition, Dr. Brown recognizes its deep-rooted influence on Chinese society. And by examining feng shui through the lens of legal history, he offers a fresh perspective that sheds light on the interconnectedness of law, culture, and religion in China. Dr. Brown's interdisciplinary approach is another strength of the book. He draws on a wide range of primary and secondary sources, including legal documents, court records, and studies of religion and environmental history, as he has just demonstrated. This allows him to provide a really comprehensive and nuanced analysis of the role of feng shui in the Qing Dynasty legal system and society. His approach also urges us to rethink the intricate connections between legal and religious practices in China, which opens up new space for more in-depth conversations. Dr. Brown's interpretation of Feng Shui as a communal discourse is particularly insightful. He shows how Feng Shui was used by both elites and commoners to negotiate power and influence. This perspective offers valuable insights into the interactions and tensions between different social classes, as well as the ecology of rural communities. In many ways, his research reminds me of Philip Kuhn's famous book, Soul Stealer. Both are really remarkable studies that uncover the hidden cultural and political currents beneath the surface of seemingly superstitious social events. Because my personal research focuses on literature and religious culture, the third chapter on Feng Shui-related petitions and civil service examinations is particularly intriguing to me. Dr. Brown examines how local magistrates and gentry used Feng Shui as a tool to help foster a unified public opinion to mediate disputes over land use and public space. He demonstrates how Feng Shui was used to inform the magistrates' decisions about petitions on issues ranging from constructing pagodas to the operation of local businesses. Impressively, his materials also reveal that these Feng Shui activities not only involved the Han Chinese people, but also local Islamic communities. And I guess this is the point from which he developed his second research. And I would love to maybe hear more of your thoughts on these kind of connections between these two projects. And he also presents some anxieties from the Confucian scholars who might use Feng Shui as a tool, in his own words, to control over Buddhist, Taoist, or even Islamic sites, and to tie them into the state's civilizing projects and to legitimize institutions. Okay, so this is so much about my comments, and now I'm going to share some of my questions for Tristan. So my first questions for him are related to chapter 3. So you mentioned that building structures to alter Feng Shui and improve examination prospects started in the Song Dynasty. Were there scholars from, say, before the Qing Dynasty who used Feng Shui to petition for constructions, or were there any significant changes in the types of claims or arguments made over time? I actually have a question for Cuilan. So do you prefer me to just offer all my questions, or let Tristan respond at this point, and then I'll continue with my future questions?
I guess Tristan, you can decide if you
Yeah,
want
sure,
to
please.
do that. Yeah.
Okay, got you. Okay, so I'll just continue. My next question is about the dynamic of among like different groups of people. So in the same chapter, you also touched upon really complex dynamics among, say, local magistrates, scholars or gentries, yin-yang officials, and some religious masters. Well, in the chapter, you provide a lot of insights into the interactions among these groups. I'm still curious to know about some more specific power dynamics and decision-making processes involved. For example, you mentioned that when a magistrate summoned both registered yin-yang officials, they possibly would also sometimes include, for example, religious masters who specialize in, for example, Buddhism and Taoism. So, and to observe Feng Shui. But here I have a question. So whose decision ultimately mattered most? And you also mentioned, for example, when you're discussing the places, remote places like Nanbu, yin officials could claim higher authority, but to what extent? And also when discussing the really interesting oil press shop related petitions, I'm really fascinated by your discussion over there, by the way. And you seem to suggest that it was the magistrate who could decide whether to dismiss or accept a petition. Then by that point, did the magistrates gain a double identity of both legal representative and Feng Shui agent by using Feng Shui manuals? Or maybe to put it in a different way, can we say that because the feng shui discourse was more efficient to some extent than the formal legal discourses in places like Nambu, so can we say like whoever controlled the right to interpret feng shui could gain the concept you referred there as the minor mandate? Is it that the case? And my last question is a more general one. So I noticed that your primary geographical focus is on the Sichuan province. I'm interested in understanding how the practice of feng shui varied across different regions in China. And these regional differences have any impact on the application of feng shui principles in legal matters. Okay, that's so much of my comments, and I really look forward to Tristan's insights and response. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. I really appreciate these wonderful comments and questions. I really wanted you to read the book, and I really wanted to hear your thoughts about it. You're such an expert on, Taoism and geography and everything, so I was been looking forward to this conversation. So let me just take the questions one by one. So I think that in terms of change over time, this is a great question, and I really look forward to people looking at feng shui in the Song Dynasty, the Yuan Dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, and seeing what's similar and what's different from the Qing. But I will say that one thing, just following Ben Elman here, is that because the examination results become more arbitrary over time. That's my understanding, especially with that population growth, more people taking the exams, the passing rate didn't go up. This is a phenomenon. I mean, feng shui anxiety around the exams, I think does, Chinese scholars have dated it to at least the Song Dynasty, if not earlier, right? So in a way, you could say it's not new, but it seems to be very accentuated in the Qing. The other thing I'll say, which is intriguing in my view, is I never expected feng shui to play these roles on quote unquote frontier spaces. We think of feng shui as kind of like, oh, it's a Chinese thing, right? Hong Kong, right? Or Guangdong or whatever. What's it doing up here? What's it doing in these places? And I think that this gets into, Fei Huang, at Fei Huang, she's a Tübingen, right? She's got that great book on Yunnan and the transformation of Yunnan in the late imperial era. And, she also finds feng shui being invoked by the local literati, Confucians, as a way to exert sort of control over, these frontier spaces because exactly they're contested. So I think that those are perhaps some new things we see, or at least things that are accentuated in the Qing. I think you've stumbled upon a very fascinating question over the relationship between feng shui and, let's say, Taoist practitioners or Buddhists. How do feng shui masters relate to these groups? And the long and short of it is, the landscape is all mixed, right? In the sense of some Buddhist monks are really good at feng shui. Some Taoist priests are really good at feng shui. In Taiwan, for instance, when I talked about this project, a lot of people were like, oh, the Taoist priest will do feng shui and he'll do Taoism, right? He's got to do both, right? But that being said, one thing that as you raised, is there is a phenomenon that goes back to at least the Mongol period, I believe, in the centuries thereafter, of appointing. I think this even goes back further, as Cuilan and I have talked about this a little bit, like a local Buddhist official, a local Taoist official, like the Zhaguan, the miscellaneous officials. So there was 4 in the Ming and Qing period: a Buddhist, the head of the Buddhist, bureau, the head of the Taoist bureau, a medical officer, and an yin-yang officer. So the relationship between these 4 individuals is very, very fascinating, and I barely scratched the surface in the book. But one thing that I saw is that the Taoist officer in and the yin-yang officer often sued each other. Like we have 3 or 4 cases in one county over 1 century of them suing each other, and exactly they're fighting over jurisdiction questions. Who gets to control the spirit mediums? Who gets the say, over some festival, etc. So you could really see these local politics were super important. And I think that there's a lot more to be done in investigating these Qing, let's say imperial officials in the religious realm, right? In their roles of what they played. And then I'll just say, I think I'll just say also, it's important for me at this stage to honestly tell everybody that the legal system in legal cases don't tell us everything, right? So most cases, as you have intuited, never come to a lawsuit. That's true today, right? Right? It's like people don't want to like go to court if they can avoid it. So what we have in the archive is we have the cases that went to court. So they're already of a certain level of seriousness. Other methods have failed, etc. But the question is, if we take away the court, what does the local society look like? And I think that my guess would be there was a lot of feng shui negotiations going on. The state is kind of, maybe at some cases a last resort. And the magistrate, this kind of gets back to what I was saying in the PowerPoint, which is to say, you have this relationship of this knowledge power game in Chinese society during the Qing of who knows feng shui, who is the expert. And if the magistrate's not in the room, then maybe it's the yin yang official. But if the magistrate comes in the room and he's got a Jinshu degree, I don't think he thinks, I mean, many of them think that their knowledge is probably superior to that of the yin-yang officer. And of course, from things like Jinping Mei, we know in depictions of yin-yang officers in Chinese novels, some of them were quacks, right? Some of them didn't know feng shui at all. They got the job because of corruption, or their dad had the job. So there was all different things that are going on, and I really appreciate your questions, because I think you really nail exactly those kind of intriguing leads that I hope I can do more research on in the future, and people could do more research on. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your response. Really fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're doing very good with time, and I'm sure there might be follow-up questions, but let's move on with our second commentator. And, Dr. Lee, if you have more questions, we can save them after our third commentator. So our second commentator is Professor Wang. And Professor Wang is a William Haas Professor in Chinese Studies at Stanford University. He's the author of numerous books. So this is a long list, and this include The Sublime Figure of History, Aesthetics, and Politics of 20th Century China, as well as Illuminations from the Past. Both were published with Stanford University Press, one in 1997 and the second one in 2004. He also published History and Memory with Oxford University Press in 2004. And 2 more books came out with Duke University Press in 2022 and 2023. It's amazing. You wrote 2 books in 2 years. So the first one is China in the World, and the second one is At Home in Nature. So in addition to many of these monographs that he has published, he has also edited and co-edited 8 books, and including Chinese Visions of World Order in 2017, Words and Their Stories in 2011, and Trauma and Cinema, Cross-Cultural Explorations in 2004. He has held, teaching and, teaching positions and, taught courses at many institutions, including SUNY Stony Brook, Harvard, Rutgers, Zurich University, Eastern China Normal University, Seoul National University, and Yonsei University. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Wang for his comments and questions on Tristan's book.
Thank you very much, Cuilan, for this introduction. And It's a great pleasure to be able to participate in this wonderful discussion of this wonderful book. I really admire the book. I share some interest with Tristan Brown, and actually we talk with we have a great talk. Share our comparing notes at the dinner table, lunch table, the Stanford faculty club, right? Just a few months ago. My question really has to do with the theoretical framework that connects the religion with law. And I've been engaged in environmental humanities, and I would try to look at this relation between religion and law from that point of view. This really has to do with Feng Shui as a religious mode of apprehension of nature, apprehension of the world, and its connection with forms of rationality. Is Feng Shui rational or irrational, right? This is the question that I'm worried about. Yeah. So first, there's this idea, Tristan posits wonderful ideas, lawfulness of Feng Shui, right? So Feng Shui is a practice of analyzing natural landscape for auspicious site, for human social construct, social cultural construct, right? So ecologically speaking, it can be this whole Feng Shui enterprise could be an ecological inquiry into how non-human biosphere can be deployed as a factor for the validation and regulation in human order, shaping human order, institution, of course, in arbitrating the property right, the conflict, property rights and land uses. So that is to say, the features of nature can determine the success or failure of human action and community. So it's actually, when you try to use the one argument of Feng Shui against another argument, the Taoists really draw upon his deeper understanding of what is the biosphere integrity that is being violated. So this is use nature as a authoritative basis for the human argument, right? So this is a matter of social. Feng Shui is actually can be read as kind of social and political ecology intertwined with the natural world, natural ecology, right? And so the expert has to expert and political figures, legal administrators, have to base human decisions and order on a non-human criteria, the criteria that are much broader, deeper, and even higher than human interest and scope. As such, Feng Shui entails what? A cosmology. So it really reminds us of the Dao De Jing statement, 人法地, right? The first phrase of 人法地, humans model themselves on the earth, on the land, right? And 地法天 and 天法道, 道法自然. But the first one, the 人法地, is the key, right, for the Feng Shui. So humans model themselves on the earth. So this is the focus, the theoretical and philosophical focus of Feng Shui. So in this slide, all right, if you look at it in this slide, non-human worlds can be a transcendent judge, overseeing injustice or justice in the context of Feng Shui, in the context of Feng Shui controversy or debate or legal suit, right? So Tristan refers to this link as a legal continuum between actually non-human and the human. So he writes, a landscape in Feng Shui could be deployed as law. I understand the law that strives to secure community harmony and govern rural society. Now, the legal continuum between human and nature emphasized the underlying lawfulness of Fengshui biosphere, the Fengshui related biosphere, as the norm. There's some certain kind of a norm of the earth, norm on the landscape, like 地脉, 龙脉. This is supposed to be the norm, not simply some kind of imaginary fantasy. Because if you break the mind, 地脉, 龙脉, you break the human society, right? There is some lawfulness about this thing, about the integrity of biosphere. So the biosphere, this kind of continuum, a legal continuum linking human and non-human, should have validity and objective basis. I emphasize the objective basis is also a scientific basis that could be very well understood by ecologists and environmental scientists, because environmental science really understand the interflow of qi, interflow of matter and energy and nutrients among objects as the foundational for the environmental changes, for the evolutionary changes, right? This is what's called the circle of life. So there's something there. It has the basis in environmental science, right? So the whole idea, the whole objective basis for understanding the Feng Shui biosphere can be understood by environmental science. So the laws, that is to say, the laws of nature can be understood scientifically. Unfortunately, this is not what most Western critics, Orientalists, think about Feng Shui. They never thought the Feng Shui may have a scientific, environmental science basis there. Right? Due to this the sort of natural, due to this kind of environment, to the Enlightenment sort of a rationalist thinking, right? They would think that they think that the Feng Shui practice is superstitious, unscientific, right? So even if people want to demystify it, all right, they still go along the secular roots, right, along secular line, right, because the Feng Shui is really about human realm, about human secular conflict and quarrel over property and ownership, I think like that, right? So, I would like to see that 人法地, this whole is a model of 人法地, that's inherent within Feng Shui, is actually can be read scientifically valid as following the laws in human nature relations. So, but I would like to hear what Tristan would like to say about this kind of the scientific potential, scientific and rationality of this what looks like an irrational enterprise, right? I talk about Lu Xun's understanding of something like a Feng Shui in his work, in Lu Xun's work. Lu Xun actually said 迷信可存. It means that people sort of worship nature. There is something really ecologically scientifically verifiable about worshiping the mountains, trees, and nature in this kind of animistic practice. So he argues against this. People say, "Oh, this is irrational, superstition." He said that this is actually is something that has to stay to shore up the community, right? The worship the nature to stay not as irrational, but as a sort of as a foundation to shore up the community life, right? Another point that I want you to comment is that it's really interesting that some there's a self-reflection of Western legal thought regarding feng shui. So what Orientalists commented to see as irrational other, right? This the irrational feng shui actually reflects not the absolute the other, but it's a forgetfulness of Western legal system. Because in Western legal system, making oath on the Bible also links the secular to the transcendent, right? Linking the natural to the secular to transcendent, natural to the supernatural, right? So the performance itself is the performance of the, like swearing on the Bible or evoking a transcendent being in the Western secular practice. That means that we've never been modern. But the people who say feng shui is superstitious actually forgets this. Forgets that they have their own feng shui. I mean, the Western thought, right? This is the sort of the thought that is different from Enlightenment rationality. Also has this feng shui, like in animation, right? All kind of things, animation, right? Animation and the pray to a higher being, the supernatural thought. There's a lot of it, right? Right. So I like the way Tristan points out that actually that's really it's about the forgetfulness of the Western legal thought and Western intellectual tradition about their own sort of a feng shui-like practice. Okay, these are my comments. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Wang. I really appreciate your wonderful comments. And I'm so excited that you could join us today. I've always enjoyed our conversations. And going back, as you said, at Stanford, I gained so much from talking to you about this. So it's great that we can continue this conversation and bring other people into it. Let me take like I think your second point first, which is to say, yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's just a product, an accident of history that we don't see feng shui as a universal, right? Why, right? Westerners have feng shui, right? Middle Easterners have feng shui, right? As China becomes now, confident and wealthy, everything like that. Maybe in 100 years from now, we will talk about feng shui all over the world, right? It's totally possible that will happen. Because there is a lot here to take seriously. And I think you're absolutely right that feng shui is pertinent to so many questions that are afflicting humanity right now. It doesn't have easy answers to them, but it's relevant to the questions. So I really like that point that you raised. Let me say something about the ecological knowledge, right? So this question about how is feng shui a traditional ecological knowledge? To what extent? What does it center? What does it not center? I really like how you do this Renfa Di, right? The people modeling on the land, right? In this discourse from the Tao Te Ching. I'll say this. I had a colleague at MIT who asked me after hearing my talk one day, she turned to me and she said, "What does feng shui say about animals?" And I had to be honest and say, it doesn't talk about animals. This is the thing about how when we talk about the sort of transcendent notions of nature in China, the various traditions had different approaches, right? So Buddhists talk a lot about animals, right? Chen Huaiyu does a wonderful job with this in the Tang Dynasty, and beyond, because the Buddhists care about reincarnation. So therefore, animals are part of the world, right? Like, the ox could be somebody's reincarnated grandfather. So, in a sense, the Buddhist cosmology gives animals a space. To be honest, I don't see feng shui giving the same prominence or voice to non-human animals. Now, this is not to say it doesn't have something to say about the environment. It does. It's just that it doesn't focus on the tiger or the chicken or any of the. It's just feng shui manuals never talk about those things, and feng shui lawsuits never talked about those things. But feng shui talks a lot about mountains, trees, water. These kinds of elements of the land, of the earth, right? Like that it pays a lot of attention to those things. And cutting a tree down can be a very serious act, right? That can affect the health of human beings. This is a very interesting idea in feng shui of the environment literally affects our health. And
Yeah.
I think that this is something that is definitely people are paying more and more attention to stuff like this now, right? So feng shui intuitively does that. I'd say with trees, with mountains, with water, also with sound. Feng Shui in China traditionally paid a lot of attention to noise pollution, and there were things that people thought were very disturbing of study and things like that. And of course, fire and dangerous activities and things like that. So I think when we look at it, what we call the environment or nature today, in China's past, we have to break it down into various kind of, what's the Buddhist approach? What did the Buddhists say about, for instance, this thing? What did the feng shui folks say about this other thing? And they might not have the same conclusions or even the same focus. So I think pointing that out then allows us to think about sort of how our own notions of nature are just totally constructed, right? This gets into, I think, your first point as well about the rationality question. And of course, Westerners and Orientalists who went to China, they thought feng shui was irrational. And so it got that label. But, the point that I, of course, start the book with is, why do we assume law is rational? It seems like there's a ton of irrational laws in the United States, right? There's what's the rational basis of law, right? So feng shui can be irrational and it can be rational, and law can be irrational and law can be rational. So these two forces, right, as the way I envision it, totally could mutually reinforce and inform each other over time. And that contradiction that a lot of people saw in the early 20th century simply wasn't there. Now, this is a great opportunity to just say to everybody here, this term superstition is such a pernicious word in the 20th century, not only because it's a neologism, but because basically we use it to just say forms of thoughts or ideas that we don't take seriously. That's basically all we mean by it, right? And we say, oh, that's superstition. Oh, that's superstition means so we don't take it that seriously, right? Or we disagree with it, right? But what we consider to be superstitious is just at times, upon close scrutiny, very arbitrary. I don't have a big discussion of this in the book, but for instance, one of the things that I pose or I've thought a lot about is the history of medicine in 20th century China vis-a-vis feng shui.
Wow.
So, Zhongyi, right, becomes sort of embraced, celebrated. It becomes like how the state sort of re-rationalizes it, right? It embraces it and says, we're gonna take this, it works, this has a scientific basis, everything like that.
That's right.
There were critics of Chinese medicine, and there still are critics of Chinese medicine, but Chinese medicine fell on that side of the spectrum. Feng Shui fell on the other side of the spectrum, even though intellectually they share quite a lot, and they share a mutually enforced, mutually dependent at times history. So I think that what's exciting and interesting about this is none of it is fixed. Right. Feng Shui today, in the 1950s, maybe it was a Fengjian Mixin, right? It was feudal superstition. Now it can go into something like, oh, it's a custom or it's a softening a little bit. Who knows in 50 years, like what it could be. What we can say is that there is a huge demand around the world for ways to think about the environment in ways that can be productive to our current human condition. And so there's, I think, a huge audience for feng shui. I mean, I mean, there's a huge audience for it. And so it totally could be the case. that we see not just a renaissance, but a resurgence, a re-evolution, you know, an evolution of the discourse in the subsequent decades. What I mean, just one final point on this, on sort of, does it have a scientific basis? Well, it's kind of like asking, you know, the Ben Cao Gongmu or the Chinese medicines. Some of the things did have scientific bases, right? Some of them were speculative. The thing is that there are ways to make feng shui more scientific, and that could be one way that it evolves. I mean, we see now, for instance, ongoing projects to apply AI to the analysis of apartment blocks and lighting and things like that. So that process of making feng shui quote unquote smart is already happening in Singapore. It's already, you know what I mean? And so who knows what that's going to look like in 50 years? I think that's a really intriguing story to think about. So yeah, I mean, I think I tried to touch on everything that you brought up, and I really appreciate your comments again, Professor Wang. I mean, they're always just so fruitful, and you get to some of the core big questions that I'm trying to ask really so well. Thank you so much.
Okay, so this is great, and we are still perfect with timing. And now we're going to proceed with our comments from our third commentator, Professor Robin Wang. Professor Robin Wang is professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and she's also the Berggruen Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Her research and teaching focus on Chinese and comparative philosophy, and particularly on Taoist philosophy, as well as the intersections of women and gender in Chinese thought and culture. She has published widely, a number of essays that bridge classical Taoist philosophy with modern philosophical discourse, offering critical insights into their relevance in addressing contemporary global challenges. She's the author of the acclaimed book, Yin Yang, The Way of Heaven and Earth in Chinese Thought and Culture, that was published with Cambridge University Press in 2012. And she also edited a volume, Images of Women in Chinese Thought and Culture, Writings from the Pre-Qing period to the Song Dynasty. She is a member of the steering committee for the International Federation of Philosophical Societies, where she actively engages in shaping the future of philosophical inquiry on a global stage. She has regularly served as a peer reviewer for publishers, contributing to the advancement of academic excellence across multiple disciplines. I also noticed that Professor Robin Wang has been a very regular contributor to this platform, and she acted as discussant and chairs, and also gave lectures on this platform. So again, thank you so much, Professor Wang, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Liu. I have to say, when first time I saw this book, I kind of like happily surprised, because I said, wow, finally somebody doing serious study of feng shui, because feng shui it's not just a tool, but actually is somewhat the way of Chinese life, and I do think, Tristan, you did a wonderful work to elevate it, status of feng shui. I think take feng shui seriously from academic point of view. Particularly, you made a connection, the feng shui and the legal system. It's really, for me, it's really mind-blowing. It's like, wow, I very happy to see this work done, because I know quite better, idea of feng shui, and in practical sense, people constantly ask me, do you believe feng shui? 你相信风水吗? My students were all kind of, whether they should get married, whether they should, have a child once. It's all these kind of things like constantly being asked. So I said, I'm a little bit puzzled too, I really enjoy this book, and my question mainly is actually it's about the knowledge, because you do thinking about the feng shui, you take a feng shui as a knowledge, right? So a wonderful question you actually asked in the page 26 is the end. So you ask this question, when and why did the feng shui become so prevalent in Chinese legal life? I think this is such wonderful questions. So my question actually kind of like a little twist, since you think about, you take a feng shui as a body of knowledge, then I come to two questions. I don't not know whether this question is possible even answered, okay? So first the question I was thinking about, feng shui is such loaded terms. You can think about it from different angles, right? And then there is so different branches and a different way practice feng shui. So I'm kind of want you give a quick, some sort, I don't know whether it's definition or you want to see, okay, based on your research, how do you think feng shui is all about? Because I know right now, for example, some Northern European countries, some women started doing feng shui of clothes. How I wear this clothes, how do my feng shui look like to you? So you become really into like presenting feng shui as a umbrella term to somehow either, so then this question, maybe you can think about feng shui ultimately is thinking about human beings' connection with environment, you want to see, with others, with world, with nature, whatever that is. So I'm kind of like want you to see, well, how do you really define feng shui? And also feng shui, could you give this kind of like a is a basic branches? I know Tibetans has a feng shui, right? So they are even going somewhere, they always use compass, then to define where its positions, and then they give you all the theories. I also know some feng shui masters, they actually make a living out of it, and to see whether your business will be flourishing or not, based on his account. Then he has a book to consulting it. So it's this kind of whole messy practice, but is there something you can like guide us to say, okay, let's see, this is how we think about feng shui. So that's my first question. Second question, I'm thinking about this production of knowledge. So how feng shui knowledge being transmitted. If we think about this in Chinese tradition, let's think about Confucianism transmitted by academy, by imperial examinations. Taoist, we see knowledge is transmitted by master and the disciples. Right, so you have some sort of social structure or social some space for this knowledge to transmit from one generation to the next generation. But what about feng shui? If it's knowledge, how do they transmit it from one generation to another generation? Is it oral transmission? Or just somehow people just do it and then somehow gain some reputation, and then somehow he become a master of in this regions. So it's partially right now contemporary China, I think maybe at least I think 80% of Taoist temples we were doing some sort of feng shui spinning on you. So are they a part of transmitting feng shui knowledge, right? So what has happened to this kind of knowledge being transmitted from one generation to another generation? I'm also very puzzled by this. And then I also thinking, because this is important for us to understand how Chinese truly in the daily life to thinking about the humans or themselves, relationship with others, more importantly, their place in the world. So I think if we can understand that how things is happening, that will be wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Professor Wang. I really appreciate it. First of all, it's such a great pleasure to finally talk to you face to face. I've been enjoying your work for such a long time, and I wanted to talk to you about this for so long. And so I'm really so glad you accepted the invitation. Thank you so much. And thank you for reading it, and thank you for these wonderful comments. So let me start out by saying I am guilty of something in this book, which is to say I just used the umbrella term feng shui to make the book readable. To be honest with you, if I was being really precise with my academic terminology, there's Dili, Kanyu, Feng Shui, they all had different subtle meanings in Chinese society in the pre-modern context, right? For instance, just give you an example, Hanyu is often, as far as I could see, is kind of academic in a sense, right? Scholars, literati use this term Kanyu. It's kind of heavy. Feng Shui is what the 老百姓 do. It's the popular term. So it's kind of fitting that Feng Shui actually became the kind of stand-in for the whole spectrum of practices and knowledge that we would consider to be analyzing the environment and that relationship for the benefit of humans and communities and such. So I think you really hit the nail on the head something here. I made the editorial decision when I was writing the book to simplify the terms, because if I split them up in every way, it would be very difficult to follow. So in a sense, I'm guilty of just embracing this broad feng shui term. Now, that being said, I definitely we have to put some boundaries on feng shui. And I think one thing that my book can maybe help the conversation among historians and among people interested in the contemporary scene is seeing in China, what did people discuss in relation to feng shui? What did they not discuss, right? So for instance, the clothing, things like that, I've never seen a case about that. So I can say, I'm not going to say it had nothing to do with it. Of course, we know clothing had all this cosmological meaning in terms of what the emperor wore and his symbology and all of that. But in terms of what is in the feng shui manuals, right? And what I would say is the feng shui manuals center the natural and built environment. That's the environment that exists out there and the environment that human beings create. So what's interesting is when we say environments, right? Nowadays, we think about it like Yellowstone National Park, right? Or Yosemite National Park, right? But one thing about feng shui is feng shui does not make this distinction. You can analyze feng shui in Los Angeles, or you can analyze feng shui in Yellowstone National Park, right? It's the natural and built environment. There's a continuum there. So that's one thing I think I can say has been there for a long time. The other thing is a lot of the existing academic literature on feng shui made a very big deal about the schools of feng shui. Compass school, form school, this Li Qi Pai, other different schools, and Jiangxi Pai, the Jiangxi school, Fujian school. What I found interesting in the legal cases that I analyzed from the Qing Dynasty is that very rarely did people make these distinctions. People basically thought that there was a body of knowledge out there that was called Bili Kanyu Feng Shui, and there was some compass, there was forms could matter, right? They didn't care so much about the affiliations. That's my sense of it. I never saw a legal case where an affiliation of I'm a member of this school of feng shui really. Now, that's not to say it doesn't matter among the practitioners. It definitely can. And for instance, I'll just say the Qing Tianzhen Feng Shui Zhonglun, the book written by the Astronomical Bureau about feng shui during the Qing Dynasty, they do talk about the compass and the form school. And they say we should borrow from both, although form is superior. So there is some discussion in the intellectual circles about what's the right approach, what should we use. But But I will just say that in terms of most people in China, I think that they probably didn't spend a lot of time thinking about what is the exact school affiliation, et cetera. This being said, I think you raise so many really great points in your comments. I think it's fascinating. The compass is such a fundamental technology used around the world today, and so few people know that not only does it come from China, but it came from Feng Shui divination, right? I mean, it's like this is the origins of the compass in human history. And so I think that there's a fascinating story to bring out here about, Feng Shui, the use of the compass, the Chinese compass, the use for Feng Shui is so large. And then one branch of the compass comes to be used in navigation. Another continues to be used not on the sea, but on the land, right? By, the Feng Shui masters and practitioners. I noticed a lot of activities that we wouldn't necessarily even think about as Feng Shui activities. They will invite in the Qing Dynasty a Feng Shui master to help. For instance, when they map in the late Qianlong reign in the late 1700s, the Dayunhe, they map the Grand Canal. And in order to map the Grand Canal, they need a luopan. They need a compass. So they invite because who has the compass, right? The Feng Shui masters. And they can place the compass on the cargo ship and tell what the direction of the canal is at any given time, and they map it and analyze it out. So Feng Shui masters were all over the place in late imperial China, in traditional China. And they were doing things that we would see as related to Feng Shui today, and also things that were beyond what we would think about as related to Feng Shui today. So when you bring up the example of people talking about design or clothing and something like that, in a way that we could say, does it have a historical basis? Well, what I can say is Feng Shui masters have been doing a lot of different things for a very long time, right? If there's an audience for it and they could say something about it, they would. So I think, on the one hand, I think one way to read the book is to say to people in the United States or beyond, this is something close to what Feng Shui was like in traditional China. And it's different than what Feng Shui is like in 21st century America. So that is one thing the book can help show people. On the other hand, is exactly as you say, Feng Shui is a living knowledge system, right? I don't want people to think like, oh, it's stuck in the past and never changes. It constantly changed, and it's still changing. So that's, I think, something that I would also add to that. Let me just see if there was anything else I wanted to say. I guess one final thing I'll say in terms of probably the biggest distinction is that in traditional China, Feng Shui was used for two major realms, the Injai and the Yangjai, right? The houses of the dead and the houses of the living, right? So it's the way in which Feng Shui thought about audience and what it needed to do is it needed to talk a lot about graves and the dead and also about houses, right? And about where people live, right? And that can be extended to entire towns and cities and whole living communities, right? Feng Shui could work on all those different scales. So I think that one thing that I notice is that nowadays, Americans do not associate Feng Shui with the dead. When I tell them, there was a lot of gravesite stuff in China traditionally, that's something that often seems to be surprising to them. Like, oh, I thought it was about interior, design or something like that. So I think that's another thing that maybe the book can illuminate for people of like, actually what this was applied to. It is different than some of the things that it's being applied to today. So I hope that kind of answered some of your questions. But again, I really appreciated your thoughts and questions about that because they're so great, they're so rich.
Okay, so this brings us to the closure of the first round of comments and questions from our commentators. We have about 29 minutes left, and this is what we're gonna do. So I'm gonna exercise my, use my privilege as a chair to ask a few questions, and then I will make sure to leave at least 15 minutes to the audience and also our commentators. So we will have about 15 minutes to take questions from the audience. I think you can, I just tested it. I think you can, if you have a question, you can either text it in the chat function, or you can just raise your hand when it's time to open the floor to the general audiences for questions. So first of all, Tristan, I really wanted to congratulate you on this wonderful book. And also I wanted to say that I think we should all celebrate your generosity as a scholar and also writer, by not only producing a wonderful book that touches on so many fields, Chinese history, religion, and law, and natural environment, but also I think you are so generous in sharing with us, in producing such an excellent book, what you have done behind the scene, and also I think many of the junior scholars and particular graduate students, and we only get to see the finished fine product of a printed book, but we have no idea what happened behind the scene. So I think your opening introduction about how do historians go about looking for the material and how do you deal with material, I think that part is really, really valuable. And also for those of you who haven't had a chance to read Tristan's book, I highly recommend it for several reasons, because this is really a fine piece of work. It's like based on extensive research, but it's written in a way that is so accessible. You don't have to know anything about China. You don't have to know anything about law or geomancy or religion to follow his narrative. And I think, one of the other things that I wanted to highlight is I just feel like this is more than just one book. Like this is 4 books condensed into one, because, for example, the chapter on mining Sichuan, that entire chapter, after finish reading that, you get an idea of, mining history in Sichuan in the Qing Dynasty. You also get an excellent overview of the legal regulations, not just about mining in Sichuan, but the legal regulation on mining in general during the Qing Dynasty. So, by reading one chapter, you get an excellent an overview, encyclopedia overview of everything that you need to know about mining, about Qing in Qing China. So I have 2 more specific questions. So the first one is a smaller one, and that's about the place of the Fengshui law cases in the Nanbu County archival. So you mentioned that you collected about 500 cases. A lot of them come from the Sichuan archives, from the Nanbu County archive, from the Bar County archive, and also you collected cases from the archives in Beijing and Taiwan. There are 500 of them. I know that, after I read your book, I went through the Nanbu County archives that were published. I'm going through some of them. So there are 84,000 manuscripts there. And you find 500 cases combining the archives from Nanbu, Bar County, Beijing, and also Taiwan. So my first question for you is, to what extent, what is the percentage of cases among all the Fengshui lawsuits? To what extent do they represent the reasons that motivated people in that area in Nanbu to go to court? Is Fengshui cases the #1 reason for people to go to the court, or it accounts for a significant size of the causes, but they are not the primary reason for people to go to the court? And my second question is a comparative question. So I wanted to provide you with some information. And again, this is related to your chapter about mining in Sichuan province. So I wanted to provide you with some information about a case that I've recently read from another archive in Qinghai province, but it's about mining. It's about local people's protest against mine developing plans, but the responses are so different. So here's some information for you to do the comparative work. So the case that I recently read is a case about protest from the local Tibetans in Qinghai province in Tongren County, and this is known as the Ribgong area. So there's a Tibetan village, and on a nearby mountain, the Qing government had plans, and this is dated to roughly the period around your case, like in the very end of 1900 in the Guangxu eras. Like I think if I remember correctly, maybe like 1895, 1898. So the government had plans to develop the lead mine on this mountain in the Tibetan, near the Tibetan village. The protest was very different because in your case in Sichuan, many of the local government officials in the Nambu County, they objected to the mining plants, and they said, no, we should issue bans and stop anybody from digging on the mountain. So in the case that I read from Qinghai, from Ribgong in the Tibetan community, those were the cases. Okay, so first of all, the Tibetan villagers, they objected to the mining plans and citing reasons that are very different from the ones that you've written about in your chapter. So what they mentioned nothing about Feng Shui. I think there's so much things that you can talk about. Maybe is it because this is a Tibetan community where Feng Shui has less influence? And what I wanted to share with you is that the responses are so different. It's the Tibetan people who are living in the community. They were strongly against the mining plans, but the Han Chinese officials from the Xining prefecture level, and also from the Chinese officials from the Xunhua sub-prefecture government, they support this government plan to develop the mine. But the local Tibetans objected against it, and their primary reasons there are two reasons. The first one is they said long-term mining on the mountain could disturb the mountain spirits. And for doing that, they could bring bad luck to the entire community. And the second reason was they were saying, this entire mine developing project could be illegal because the mine workers that were brought there to dig on the mountain, they were the Salar and Hui Muslims, hired from the Xunhua sub-prefecture. They did not even wear the government uniform. So I mean, if you compare these two, there are just like so many different, differences between the responses from the local community, from the local government officials. I was just wondering, this is not a fair question because you didn't work on the Qinghai Xunhua archives, but I was just wondering, based on your research or extensive research on the mining issue in Sichuan, do you have any insights on what's going on and why do people respond so differently? Like especially the local officials have so different responses to the mining plans in these two places.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Professor Liu. This is absolutely wonderful. First, let me say thank you so much for your kind comments about my book. I really appreciate it. I'm glad it's not a slog to read. It was a slog to write. So I'm glad it came out decent in the end. Let me say, just as the first thing is, we all sacrifice a lot to do our work, right? I mean, like it's so hard to write a book. We all know that, right? And it takes years, and you'd spend nights and you spend all the time. And the only way to do it is if you love the topic, right? I mean, that's really it, and the reason I took a chance when I was in grad school and told my advisor, Maddie Zellin at Columbia, that I was going to do Feng Shui, that, I was like, because I like this topic and I found it interesting and I found it inspiring. And in a way, I do have this sense of wonder about it, in the sense of once you see it, it opens up a whole new world of possibilities for thinking about examinations, for thinking about mining, right? Mining is like, we think, oh God, it's such a boring topic. I don't mean to say that, but it's like, you throw in a little feng shui and then all of a sudden, wow, this is a really interesting conversation, right? So that's how I kind of was able to just keep going through all those years of reading and writing about it. Let me first just say, when your question about, what percentage of cases are we talking about? How representative of this, Nambu County, Ba County, how representative are these places? Here's what I will say on this. Feng Shui was not the majority of legal cases in the Qing dynasty. There are cases about salt, there are cases about debts, there are cases about theft, there are cases about everything. But there are more Feng Shui cases than one might suspect. What I would say is, Qing officials complained about the number of Feng Shui cases. We saw that in Hunan, we see that in Sichuan, we see that across southern China. Basically, local officials, even provincial level officials saying, 就是这边的人祸于风水, right? They're obsessed with feng shui. They just do it all the time. They care about it too much. So we see those complaints. Now, that means what I can say statistically is what I have found and what scholars in China who have worked on the Ba County collections have found, we actually came to fairly similar numbers. About like 20% of the routine lawsuits are about like graves and trees around graves, something like that. So it's not the majority, but it's a sizable number, right? And exactly as you say, Nambu County is composed of like thousands of lawsuits, and I only pull out 500. It sounds, and from that and other collections, it sounds like a big number, but it's really not a big number, right? In fact, there's a lot more I could have done. If I had more time, I would have tried, right? But yeah, it is. I think these cases were not rare. They were fairly common. Magistrates are never surprised by them. They see them rather routinely, especially those cases that are about graves broadly construed. I'll also say that there is a sort of stereotype that has persisted even to this day that basically 中国南方人很信风水，北方人不这么信. This I find is not really the case. What I would say is Southerners definitely cared a lot about feng shui, right? Like it's prominent. Southerners have a lot of mountains. They have trees on the mountains. They have water. There's a lot of reasons to care about feng shui in South China. But there are a lot of feng shui cases about mining in northern China, in Shandong province, Hebei province, Shanxi province. You will find Shanxi province all across North China. I have found feng shui cases. So in other words, it was a legal phenomenon that was found literally across China. Of course, places in the south like Taiwan, Fujian were particularly prominent, but it was not exclusive to those places. So that's one thing. Second, when we get to your case about the Tibetans in Qinghai, right? And this is the Shunhua collection. There are 2 points that I'd say here. First is anytime we're looking at legal cases, especially those involving development like mining, from the late Qing, we have to realize that like the last decade of the Qing, everything changes, right? And especially things, if we get like 1898, this is right on the border where the incentives to get mining and development going are becoming quite strong on these officials. So for most of the Qing, what I find in Nambu is, they don't want, like don't allow the mining. It's just going to cause problems, right? So that was kind of like maybe their bias. But then in the last decade of the Qing, you do see a change, right? They're being incentivized to encourage the development a lot more. So the first thing I'd say is you're dealing with a late Qing case in which those officials are probably being tasked or are under the pressure of those new incentives. That's one thing. Second thing is that it's also true. This is a great question that ties into something that Professor Wang also was mentioning earlier about the universality of feng shui. I found actually discourses that are found in like Qing Shilu, Qing veritable records, where Amban station, Qing officials stationed in Tibet, report back with memorials to the emperor saying the Tibetans are obsessed with feng shui. And we say for a minute, what do they mean by that, right? Are the Tibetans obsessed with feng shui? And what we see is that these Qing officials were observing these belief practices that the Tibetans had about mountain deities, maybe some Buddhist cosmologies, and they were trying to think of, how do I explain this in the memorial to the emperor or a memorial to Li Fanyuan or whatever, right? I'll just say 他们很信风水啊. Basically that was how they described it. So for much of the Qing dynasty, actually, I think the Qing government, they thought that the whole world did feng shui. The Chaoshan did feng shui, Yunnan did feng shui, Ryukyu did feng shui. Of course the Tibetans do feng shui, right? You know what I mean? Like they care, like everybody who's proper, right, does feng shui. And there's also a great description by a Qing Anban of the feng shui of Lhasa, where he gets to Lhasa and he goes, this city is totally laid out like an imperial capital of a good feng shui for the Patala Palace and everything, right? So the question of feng shui being used in relation to Tibet is one in which there's quite a bit we can say about in the Qing. I'll say one final thing here, though, is I think in terms of, mining was often contentious, right? It makes sense that there was opposition to mining for exactly the reasons that you talk about. Mining invites people, laborers who are not local. So a population of a rural county can swell as a few hundred miners come into town, and they're not married and they might be gambling and they might be drinking, right? So mining causes a lot of other issues in the Qing, and in Sichuan we see that very much. So there were a lot of reasons why some officials were wary about mining. But again, my suspicion, not having seen the case, would be in the late Qing, those incentives do change a bit. So they take the brakes off and basically say, okay, now let's try to mine everything. At least some of the officials do, right? So that's what I think. Thank you so much for your question. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And now I think we can officially open the floor to questions from the audience. If you have any questions, okay. Stephen Anglo, can you just unmute yourself? Yeah, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thanks so much. This has been really fascinating. And I have not read the book yet, but I just ordered it, so it seems great. So the question I have is about the difference between caring for individual aspects of the built-in natural environment versus caring more systematically. So the difference between loving the view out back, or maybe the particular trees around a grave, versus being worried about deforestation or something like that. And mining might be an easier case than trees, but I was originally thinking about this about like caring about the forest instead of just the trees, as it were. Is this something we can see in the litigation around feng shui? Because I've long been struck by the fact that you have lots of Confucians who care about the environment, at least in sort of individual ways, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of environmentalism. So any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for this question. It's a great question. Let me just say that one of the interesting but also difficult things about feng shui in studying feng shui historically is that feng shui worked on different scales. So there is the feng shui of the individual family. And of course, in that sense, I'm selfish. I want my family to have the best feng shui. I might even want to have better feng shui than my brother over there, right? So it can be competitive, right? On the other hand, feng shui can be communal, exactly in the way that you're talking about, right? It could be, well, the village, right? The whole village, we're concerned about the feng shui collectively, and we don't want to oppose this mine. And you even have discourses by the late empire, Ming and Qing at least, and maybe, Wanmeng, you can tell us, it doesn't go back to the Song, I'm not sure, but certainly we do in the Ming and the Qing about the feng shui of the empire, right? The whole country, like the Long Mai, the whole thing. So feng shui works from the individual in the family unit, let's say, all the way up to the country unit. So that scale is what makes it so flexible, so relevant to so many different questions in Chinese society. That being said, this question of like how instrumentally environmentalist was it? And that being said, I think it's fair to say that they're not thinking about the environment and environmental protection in ways that people today would. Exactly, for instance, in the reasons I mentioned earlier about like nobody's thinking about like, oh, let's protect the tiger. No, we don't want to protect the tiger. We want the tiger to go away, right? But we do want the trees, right? Mark Elvin posed a question actually years ago, and I'm not exactly sure how much I agree with him on this, but it's a good question in which he said people in China talked a lot about trees, not so much about forests. Okay, right? You know what I mean? About protecting the whole thing, but there were trees that were really important that needed to be protected. I'm not totally 100% sure I'm on board with that, but I think it's an interesting point. So what I think we can say regarding, a mountain that gets denuded of trees, people notice that stuff. Even the Hmongza notices that stuff, right? All the way back, right? Ox Mountain. That being said, there are intriguing cases that I have seen in Sichuan. I'll give you one example. There's a case, Sichuan had salt industry all over the province, right? Salt is very profitable in Sichuan. And there was a county north of Chengdu in which people wanted to mine for salt there and pursue the industry. And there was such deforestation in the local area because salt is very resource intensive, right? You have to boil the brine, you have to do all that stuff. You have to have fire going all the time. So if you don't have access to coal, you need to use firewood, you need to use timber for it. And there's one magistrate came in and actually said, there's too much, like the decline of the vital qi in this entire area is so severe that I'm going to ban the mining of salt here because there's going to be no tree left. And so you can kind of see the application of feng shui discourse, you could say, to describing that problem. And so I actually think in this regard, I sort of think that there are examples, right, that seem to be quite environmental. But I do think that being said, and in that degree, I might disagree with Alvin. But I will say that there are a lot of feng shui cases that are about, well, this tower is, taller than this building, and that's a problem, right? So we shouldn't think that not every feng shui case is going to look like, it belongs in the EPA, right? Discourse, right? There's a lot of stuff that was cultural, that wasn't environmental. But definitely, like, there were questions that were, quite environmental and debated in feng shui terms.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
We have about 6 minutes left, so we have time for one or two more questions, either from the audience or from our panel of commentators. So, Yan Shuo, please, please unmute yourself.
Oh, hi everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So very good to see Professor Wang, Wanmeng, and everybody else here. What a fascinating topic. I was just very interested in some of the points raised earlier about sort of this distinction between the spirited nature versus this kind of practical approach to nature that Tristan, you talked about in terms of the Han Chinese approach to feng shui and the environment. So I think, given my own research interest, I'm very interested in this question of, Professor Bangwa's earlier point about this intersection between the supernatural, the transcendental, and the practical understanding of nature that we can witness in the Han Chinese approach to feng shui. So, and comparing that to the sort of the Tibetan version of seeing mountains, rivers, forests as this inanimate but nevertheless divine and sacred embodiment of this kind of maybe transcendental reality. So I think as we were talking, I had this very sort of preliminary hypothesis or question about, for example, when we talk about the Tibetan Buddhist approach to nature, the traditional Tibetan ways of governance were viewed by scholars as theocracy, right? But because of its sort of understanding of this otherworldly, beyond human nature of things. Whereas when we talk about like feng shui in the Han Chinese context, we rarely talk about, for example, the Han Chinese government or ways of governance as a sort of this theological, theocratic way of governance. So where does that discrepancy come from? In other words, when we talk about feng shui, there seems to be this dimension of the secular and the vernacular that seems to stand at the front of our understanding, at least of the Han approach to feng shui. Whereas in many other minority cultural contexts, when we talk about nature, it's almost always embedded in this divine, otherworldly, transcendental understanding of nature. So I'm just thinking out loud. It's not a question per se, but just thinking out loud the rich intersections of human society, governance, and nature, and how do we understand nature differently? Yeah.
Well, so thank you so much for this really rich and exciting comment and question. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for coming, and thanks so much for offering these really wonderful thoughts. I think absolutely, this gets to the question, which is a totally valid one, of what religion is, and should we talk about feng shui in relation to religion? Do we put it in that category? Part of the issue, of course, is when we talk about theocracy or theology or religion, we are talking about Western frameworks that don't map that well, right, on the Chinese context. So I think that's the first thing. I follow, there have been people like Tim Brooke who focus on the secular nature of Chinese statecraft going back centuries. And there are also people like John Lagerwey, who has a wonderful book, China, a Religious State, where he says, no, we should see Chinese statecraft and governance as totally intertwined and interwoven with religion. On that point, I mean, while I understand both approaches, I see religion all over Chinese statecraft, right? Broadly speaking, right? If we have to pose that. So in a way, what we might see as, oh, well, this is what the Han Chinese do, and this is what the Tibetans do, and it seems like one of them is quote unquote spiritual and the other one is secular. My intuition would be to say it's a very sort of artificial distinction that is probably pretty recent. That the Chinese statecraft that we see in the Song period, and I'm sure Song, Yuan, Ming, Qing period at least, the magistrates were involved, the local officials were involved in rain-making rituals and all different types of, Taoist liturgy, feng shui analysis, all of this stuff like that. I think that another point that, your comments really remind me of is, what is a religious claim and what is a claim that is simply taken as possibly true? So for instance, just to give a quick example, if a tree is cut down and a child falls ill, right? We might say today, it's like, well, what's the connection between those things? But people in China saw a connection between those things, right? And so what do we call that, right? What do we call that form of knowledge being expressed, right, as we see in these lawsuits? So I think your question about what are the contours of religion in this story? And what are the contours of religion as applied to Chinese politics and law, past and present, vis-a-vis other groups, is a really rich one. And I'd be thrilled to talk to you more about it sometime.
Okay, it's exactly 11 o'clock sharp. Paul, are you there? Should we, I was told that we should end on time at 11 o'clock. I think we did wonderfully.
Yeah, we did a great job. So thank you, everyone. This is again, the idea of Sahai Weisue, right, is for people to come together and have nice conversations, and we did that wonderfully. So thank you guys all so much. And special thanks actually also to Stephen Engel. He's always helping Sahai Weisue in lots and lots of ways. So it was really great to see you here today. And I'll see you soon in Korea, Stephen. So thank you again, everyone. This has really been wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you especially to Paul and all of our discussants that are chair. Thank you all so much for coming. I'll write you all emails. Thank you personally, but I really appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.